The oldest and strongest human emotion is fear. And the oldest and strongest type of fear is trepidation of the unknown. When we were children, our parents told us that monsters didn't exist. But we were sure that something was lurking under the bed or in the closet. Fear sees, even if our eyes are closed. Welcome to the realm of the arcane. My name is Lon Strickler. Join me as I examine unexplained creatures, strange manifestations, and remarkable realities. Imagine this next hour as a voyage of discovery to strange lands, seeking not for new territory, but for new knowledge of the supernatural. Come on board as we begin this adventure together. Hey folks, good evening and welcome to another episode of Arcane Radio, where we explore the unexplained here on the Paranormal King Radio Network. Now, I'm your host, Lon Strickler, coming to you with a cannon shot of historic Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. I thank you for joining me. Now, before I introduce my guest, I did mention last week that we were working on a second pilot report coming out of O'Hare International in Chicago, and we were able to get an interview with this pilot, and I'm going to read to you what we got from it. So this pilot has been working as a pilot since 2008, previously flew in the Air Force for 6 years, 9,000 hours of flight time, variety of aircraft. So he said that the incident happened on Thursday, August 8th, 2019, at O'Hare around 1800 hours. Now, he said he had flown into O'Hare the previous day and stayed at a hotel for the night, and he was due to fly out at 2000 hours to go to the UK. See, he was taking the airport shuttle towards the terminal, and as he looked out the window, he saw a large human with enormous wings and glowing red eyes perched upon a rail and looking right at him. Now, there was nobody else in the transport. He said the being appeared to be squatting down on the rail, but had its wings completely open and moved them slowly as he stared at the shuttle bus. Now, he said, I knew that he was watching me as its head swiveled and followed the shuttle as we passed. Its eyes locked on me the entire time. He said, I was startled and I'll admit it, very frightened. Not only by this encounter, by the absolute boldness of this thing as it didn't move and attempt to hide itself as we approached. He said we passed it on the outside lane where we were at the closest, approximately 15 foot away from it, where it was perched. Never once flinched or attempted to hide itself, just stayed put. He said he had heard the stories of the O'Hare Mothman, which is what he called it. He said other pilots are calling it the same thing, or as some have also called it, Batman. But I simply dismissed them as being nothing more than fantasy. Maybe an urban legend that was associated with already spooky airport. I mean, who hasn't heard of the weird UFO sightings around O'Hare and stories of ghosts and whatnot? What happened to me that evening changed my entire view of those stories. So when I saw the post asking for pilots to step up and to share their stories, I took advantage of the opportunity to tell my encounter with the O'Hare Mothman. Now, with after the interview with our team investigator, Manuel Navarrete, the pilot did state to him that he saw this thing, it was squatted down. The arms appeared to be gripping the guardrail and were long and very skinny, almost bony, and were jet black. He didn't get a good look at the fingers of the entity, but he described the length of the arms to be about 3 foot long, but couldn't give an accurate measurement. The witness said that even squatting down, the entity was still about 4 foot tall, and that if it would stand up, it would be well over 6.5 foot. The head was rounded and featureless, other than the two illuminating eyes that he described as ruby red in color. He did note that the head was not overly large and appeared to be rounded at the top. Now, the wings are black and very large, and pointing at the end appear to be segmented like that of the wings of a large bat. Now, the pilot estimated the wings to be at least 10 foot wide from tip to tip and about 5 foot in height. The wings appeared to be taller than the being by at least 2 foot and were black in color. When asked about the encounter, he stated the entity did not move at all and stayed perched on the guardrail and held its ground and didn't move. Did make eye contact, and it was just surprised. The witness was just surprised how it just stood there and looked at him. And he said the actual incident lasted between 10 and 15 seconds. So the witness did present his airline company credentials and federal identification to prove his employment, showed photos of his time with his previous employer and military service. He answered all the questions, didn't deviate away from his initial sighting report. So that's our second pilot sighting now. I had heard from other sources that many of these pilots are aware of this being, and they have been talking and discussing it on social media and among themselves. So hopefully we're going to get some more sighting reports from the pilots, other people working at the airport. We've already had 2 other security people send reports. So hopefully it continues. So tonight, I welcome author, investigator, and explorer David Weatherly to Arcane Radio. Now, David is a Renaissance man of the strange and supernatural. He has traveled the world in pursuit of ghosts, cryptids, UFOs, magic, and more. From the specters of dusty castles to remote haunted islands, from ancient sites to modern mysteries, he has journeyed to most unusual places on the globe seeking the unknown. David has investigated and written about a diverse range of topics, including hauntings, cryptozoology, ufology, ancient mysteries, shamanism, magic, and psychic phenomena. He has been a featured speaker at conferences around the world and has lectured on countless paranormal, UFO, and spiritual groups. He's a frequent guest on Coast to Coast AM with George Norrie, Darkness Radio, and other radio programs. David has also appeared on numerous television shows, including Ancient Aliens, Mysteries of the National Parks, and Beyond Belief. His latest book is Monsters of the Last Frontier, Cryptids and Legends of Alaska. His website can be found at eerielights.com. So, David, thanks for joining me this evening.
Sure, Lon. Good evening.
Man, you've been busy this week.
I always am.
Yeah, I know you are. I heard you on Dave Scott last night over at Spaced Out Radio, and you have been busy. You did another show as well this week. I think I'm pretty sure you did. So, but I know you.
I can hardly keep up.
I know. Yeah, I know how you feel, man. I know exactly how you feel. So this book is about cryptids in what you call the last frontier of Alaska. What made you decide to write this book, though we do know there's a lot going on up there?
Oh, yeah. Well, this is actually the third book. I mean, it's a standalone, but it's the third book in a series in a sense, because what happened was I started digging through my files, and a year or so ago decided to write a book on the cryptids of Nevada.
Right.
Just because I had so many unusual cases from there, and partially because, people think Nevada, come on, there's aliens, right? But there's not any monsters. And, that's not really the case. I dug up a lot of fascinating things in Nevada, and I've investigated in every state, and have, just massive case files from the years. I've been doing this stuff since the 70s. So, the things I've collected over the years from either personal investigations, interviewing witnesses, and things people have sent to me, I started realizing, wow, there's a lot of this stuff that people either haven't heard, or they're just not familiar with because it's so obscure. So I did the Nevada book, which was really well received, and then I did Arizona, which I also had a ton of case files on, and I just kind of felt like I was going to keep going, and I started looking at what state I was going to do next. I had recently spent some more time in Alaska, and it's a pretty fascinating place. It was a very every one of these books has been very unique to write, just as unique as the state is. Alaska almost more so in some ways, because it's almost the polar opposite of Nevada. I pretty much feel confident that it included almost everything. There's probably I'm sure there's a few cases here and there that maybe I didn't come across or that it just happened. But with Alaska, it was the polar opposite. I had so much. There's so many sightings and so many encounters up there. I really had to kind of distill a lot of that down in some portions of the book, particularly the section about Sasquatch, because really, I mean, you could easily fill volumes on Sasquatch encounters in Alaska. Robert Alley, of course, has done some incredible work with Rain Coast Sasquatch, and he's got something new coming out that covers some of the sightings in Alaska. But, that's just an example of a singular focus. I wanted to address that, but I also wanted to address a lot of the other cryptids in the state, many of them that people just aren't very familiar with or don't hear much about. So that was, I guess kind of how it came about. I find Alaska a very fascinating place. I couldn't imagine living there because I don't really prefer that kind of cold, a greater portion of the year. But at the same time, there's a certain mystery and almost mysticism about the environment, about the land itself up there. And of course, there's so many fascinating facets of the folklore and the native traditions and everything else up there that it really is a gold mine of fascinating stories.
Yeah, I've had several reports come out of Alaska, mostly to do with hairy hominids or unusual bipeds. It seems like every Inuit group up there has their own name for the beings. I've even had people tell me that they appear as either some type of shadow being that they really don't know what it is, but they believe it's the Kamchatka or whatever they want to call it, the Otterman or the other types of names that they use for these beings anywhere. And I've had these sightings anywhere from the Kenai Peninsula west over into Nelson Island. I mean, they're just thousands of sightings and encounters.
Yeah, very much so. And, you bring up the Otter Man, which is also known as the Kushtaka, and that really was, I always try to be incredibly respectful of native traditions. I've been blessed throughout my life to have spent a lot of time with elders from various native traditions and learned a lot of things. And, as a result, and just out of pure respect also, I try to portray those things very accurately and navigate that territory very carefully. The Acoustic Isle was a very interesting case because, first of all, a lot of Bigfoot researchers mistakenly believe that when Alaskan tribal peoples are talking about the Kushtaka, that they're talking about essentially a Sasquatch.
Right.
And, I've talked to elders up there that are very adamant that they are not the same thing. And really, when you hear the stories and you delve into the mythos, you begin to understand that we're talking about two very distinct things in their worldview, because as you stated, all of these tribes, they all have names for the hairy man, and there's so many different terms in Alaska because there's so many different tribes. They all have words that essentially describe a hairy man that we would call Sasquatch or Bigfoot. Now, when they start talking about the Kushtaka, it's a very different thing because the Kushtaka is a shapeshifter. And it is specifically an otter person or an otter man. And the lore that revolves around this creature, it sort of gets to the very heart of some of their spiritual beliefs, because this creature comes about as a result of what would maybe roughly translate as a person being lost, has their spirit or their soul being lost, maybe in the wilderness or maybe in the water, and going through a transformative process that is akin to death in a sense.
Mm-hmm.
And if this occurs, sometimes these creatures, other Kushtaka, can come and save this person. But the only way to save them is to transform them into one of their kind. And they're no longer human. Now, you get into really delicate territory because in some of the traditions, there is a shamanic process through which the person can be retrieved and saved, but only if they're gotten to in time. So it's a really fascinating thing. I mean, we can sit here and talk about this all evening because there's so many complexities to it. But essentially, we're talking about something kind of akin to a skinwalker in the Southwest, except that it's not voluntary. It's something that occurs involuntarily because of circumstances that causes this person to be transformed into a what looks like a bipedal otter. And it's I know that sounds very strange if you've never heard this before. It could sound almost kind of comical. The painting on the front of the book is another amazing cover by Sam Sharon, who's doing the covers for all of this series. And when I threw this one at him, it was it was a pretty good challenge, I think. And I said, it can't be overly creepy and it can't be, goofy looking either. And I think he came up with an amazing portrayal of this creature on the front of the book.
Oh yeah, I was surprised when I first looked at it, and I mean, if that's what people are seeing, I mean, my God.
Yeah.
I'm telling you, it's. I mean, it looks like an otter, but I guess some people could, mistaken it for a Bigfoot. I mean, the way it's built and the size. And it's funny. You talked about these being shapeshifters. I mean, they're kind of their version of the skinwalker. That's kind of what it sounded like to me when I've gotten these reports. I know there's a tribe not far from Bethel that the gentleman had contacted me and talked to me about this being that it looked and acted like a Bigfoot, but it came out of the ocean. He called it a Leviathan, but it would come out of the ocean and chase them at night when they were out on their snowmobiles. It's weird stories like that. I mean, they knew what it was, but this thing would actually be able to keep up with them as it was chasing them. So of course they would, not go out at night anymore, and which is kind of hard to do during the winter time because it's dark most of the time anyway. Sure. So yeah, there's some really crazy stories. I agree with you.
Well, and these creatures, when you start delving into different aspects of the tradition and understand their perspective, it makes a little bit more sense to you.
Yeah.
These are very old stories, and they come from tribal people that lived very close to the land. So in Alaska, the otter is a unique animal because there it can live on land and in the water. So in that sense, it's sort of an in-between creature to begin with, something that can live in two worlds, so to speak. And, they're very, otters are very family-oriented. They're often seen as very joyous creatures, by people who are studying, kind of those human-animal relations and so forth. And, when you start taking those things into account, you can kind of understand, okay, well, an otter is a very unique creature in that environment, and taken from the perspective that it dwells in two worlds to begin with, you can begin to see the shape-shifting connection that maybe would develop. And, certainly for someone who goes through that transformative process into another world, then, there you go.
All right. Now, I guess the most famous encounter case in Alaska as far as bipeds or Sasquatch would be Port Chatham. What's your take on that whole mystery? Can you kind of go into it a bit? I've talked about it before with others, but what's your take on it?
Yeah, this is a fascinating case. Port Chatham's also known as Portlock.
Right.
It's a little town that began to develop in the 1920s, and it was a cannery town. It never really grew to any to much size. They only had a small number of citizens who lived there. They all worked for the cannery, and it wasn't until much later in the 40s or so, might have been the 30s, when the town actually had a post office. But what happens with this town, first of all, it's kind of isolated. It starts having these strange occurrences in the 1930s, and it begins with a gentleman who is just in the hills outside of town, who they find murdered. Now, put yourself in this mindset. It's a very small community. They all work for the cannery. They all know each other. Suddenly somebody's dead. Mm-hmm. And it appears to be that the person has been murdered, but here's the kicker. The guy was murdered with a blow to his head by a piece of logging equipment. Now, this piece of logging equipment was too massive for a single man to move. So this mystery begins to develop. What could have possibly lifted this massive piece of logging equipment and struck this man down? So after this, other people begin to disappear in the area. Hunters go up into the hills, and they don't come back. There are gruesome legends that pieces of their body would wash down into the town in the river, and it was clear that they had been mauled and torn up by something, but the marks did not match a bear. The town, somewhere around the World War II period, or just after, the town is suddenly abandoned. And the story, this is not just an urban legend. This story has been reported in Alaskan media. Was reported in the 70s. Was reported again in the early 2000s. They actually, at one point, interviewed a woman who was an elder, originally from the town. And she was born in Port Chatham in the 1930s, early 1930s. She had distinct memories of being a little girl, and that suddenly the whole town said, "We're moving. We're all leaving." They were told to gather all of their things up. The schools were closed, their homes were shuttered, and they all left en masse and went to another town to live. Now, she says that the whole village left because of the Nantianook. That is one of the regional names that essentially translates to Big Hairy Man. Mm-hmm. So the stories are that there was this massive hairy man, this Sasquatch, living around the area outside of Port Chatham, and it was very territorial, mm-hmm. and would, had killed some of these hunters. A lot of other stories that are mixed in, people spotting 18-inch footprints, a story of hunters following a moose tracks, and that suddenly the moose tracks just stop. There are signs of a scuffle, and there's nothing, no more moose tracks, but there are a set of 18-inch tracks that lead away from the scene, and these appear to be bare human footprints, or at least something akin to that. Mm. Obviously, much larger than any man. So, this is a fascinating story. The abandoned town still sits there. I've tried on a couple of occasions to get to it. It's difficult to access because of its location, and it really takes a bit of planning. Now, I have spoken to some people who have been to Port Chatham and mm-hmm. investigated the site, and I've heard firsthand from them that it is a very strange place, even to this day. Obviously, a lot of the native people won't go there. It's become kind of taboo. But of course, that just draws people like me and people
Yeah,
who
absolutely.
are fascinated, by the legends. So I know some of these people that have gone and investigated, and they report things. Some of these guys are very seasoned investigators, and they report these strange feelings of being watched while they're in the town. A few people have heard sounds, around the town from the woods outside of the town that they equate with something that's likely a Sasquatch or a Bigfoot. So it appears that, whatever creature or creatures were living out around this town were very territorial and remain there to this day, still, I guess, protecting their land.
Yeah, it must be something going on because, quite frankly, nobody's tried to resettle the area. And I know there's a lot of old equipment staying around that's still there. Some parts of the, homes that were still there. But I have seen at least one film that was taken on an expedition there, and it is quite eerie. I don't know if they really came up with any solid evidence, but the fact they were there and some of their recollections of what they felt and how things seemed was pretty spooky. Yeah. But for a fact, you hung around JC for years, and you've seen stuff all over the country as far as with Bigfoot and other cryptids go. There's just so much supernatural aspect to it that is just unexplained. And of course, that may very well be what's going on here.
Oh yeah. And then, you've got other factors that come into the remoteness of Alaska and, the state itself. And then of course, within the state, the remoteness of a lot of these places, like this little village kind of, off to itself. The largest town, the largest city, of course, is Anchorage, and even it is not, comparatively, it's not that large. It's not like Chicago or something. So, you're talking about a very stark landscape, and a lot of people don't realize how large Alaska is. It's a massive state, and I tell people, you have to really to get a clear concept. You can go online and you type in Alaska, something like Alaska superimposed over the lower 48, and most people would be shocked at how large the state of Alaska looks over top of the lower 48 states. And, incredibly sparsely populated overall, because, of course, much of it is tundra and very remote areas that are just not really inhabitable, but even the small villages and stuff that are scattered about, often very tiny, and so much wilderness and so much wildlife. So it's very conceivable that there are plenty of things living in the wild up there that are yet to be discovered.
Oh yeah, yeah. Well, that brings us to one of the more fascinating areas to do with Alaska is some of the aquatic life or aquatic cryptids that people describe. Which one fascinates you the most? I've heard so many. Which one fascinates you the most?
Oh, well, they're all incredibly fascinating. I'm very intrigued by the Lake Iliamna monster. Now, Lake Iliamna is fascinating for a number of reasons, because first of all, it's kind of a hot spot across the board because there are Sasquatch sightings around that area too. Mm-hmm. And, there's a great Sasquatch story. And I'll get to the lake monster in a minute, but there's a great Sasquatch story that came out of Lake Iliamna, because there's a little business there that you can go and stay, and of course it's an area that draws fishermen and outdoorsmen and stuff when the weather is suitable. But there was a gentleman who was working there, and he was known. This is an area everybody knows everybody else, right? And this guy, he was known as. He would hit the booze every once in a while, and it's kind of an Alaskan outdoorsman, typical type of guy. But he was driving near the lake one day and spotted this giant hairy creature crossing the road. And, this is very much that frontier attitude of a lot of people in Alaska. His reaction was he jumped out of his truck, grabbed his pistol out of his glove box and took a shot at this thing. And it's like the old West. I mean, here he is. He doesn't know what it is exactly, but he's just taking a shot at it anyway. And he goes and tells his story. Now, the first reaction was, okay, well, he's had a few drinks and he's seen things or whatever. But some of the guys from the area went to, just out of curiosity, to see the site that he was talking about. And when they did, they found these tracks that they could not explain. Furthermore, they found that the path this thing took, crossing from one side or the other to the other of the road, the embankment was really high. It wasn't something that a human could easily navigate. So they didn't have any explanation as to what was going on here. And as the talk spread around, of course, some of the local native people said, "Oh yeah, it's the hairy man. We know about him. He lives around here." So again, here's an area that the stories go way, way back in local tradition, but it's just kept very quiet because the tribal people don't want to disturb this thing. The media gets a hold of it, and they want a whole lot of attention put on it, and of course that gets shut down by the locals. But the stories persist, and of course, in the midst of all of this happening, we also have the legends surrounding the lake itself and this monster that reportedly exists in there, and it's known as the Lake Iliamna monster. Some people refer to it as Ili. And it's a lot of different stories about exactly what this thing is. Now, I think this one's kind of fascinating because I believe it's probably a giant sturgeon. Mm-hmm. And, when you look at how large some of these creatures can get, now, maybe some people would be disappointed in that. But these things, they look like dinosaurs. I mean, these are massive, massive fish. And if there's one that's in there that has grown, to extraordinary size, that in itself would be a pretty amazing find.
Right.
There are stories of, the famous monster hunter Tom Slick tried to catch this thing. There's guys that he hired to try to capture this monster. There's a story about these guys who used a 55-gallon oil drum as a bobber. They attached it to this massive 1/4-inch thick iron hook that they baited with a chunk of moose flesh. They threw this in. They used 16-inch stainless steel aircraft cable for the line. Jeez. Went fishing for this creature. Now, you would think, okay, they maybe have a good shot. No. Whatever this thing was, they hooked it. It snapped the line. It snapped the line. Aircraft cable.
Yeah.
Snapped in two. So, whatever's down there is something that is pretty impressive. Even if it's a known animal, it's pretty daggone impressive. And the Sturgeon Theory, it's one of the ones that's floated around. Some people think it's some kind of a sleeper shark or some kind of a freshwater whale type of creature. A lot of different theories have been bandied about. But all that aside, it's it's something that nobody has exactly been able to hook and prove yet.
Mm. Yeah, I know it's a large lake, and it does seem like it's landlocked. I don't think even though it is close to the ocean, but I other than, like you said, a sturgeon, I couldn't even dream of what this may be.
Yeah, and I mean, it could be something, that is just unknown or you know, a lost creature that we just you know, we think is extinct. That's very possible in a place like Alaska. But you know, the white sturgeon at this point is a pretty good candidate just because of the size and because of the armor plating that they have on their back. And they, you know, like I said, they look very prehistoric. They're very powerful creatures. Jeremy Wade went up there, River Monsters, and he went searching for whatever was in the lake, and he came away convinced that it was probably a sturgeon because he heard stories from some of the locals who wouldn't really talk, you know, much to the media or anybody else, but he's got a talent and a knack for, you know, talking to people, just, you know, other fishermen and so forth. And he heard stories from people who said no, they'd seen the thing and it was a sturgeon that was living in there. But again, you know, that's just as impressive just because of the potential massive size of this creature. I mean, snapping a 16-inch aircraft cable, that's an impressive feat no matter what it is.
Yeah, really. I don't even think a bear could do that.
No.
Yeah, that's amazing. Well, speaking of bears, were you able to get over to Kodiak at all, and look at that place and maybe hear any stories that came out of Kodiak?
There's not as much as you would think from there. I mean, there's some Sasquatch accounts. You pretty much find Sasquatch accounts everywhere in the country. There in the state. There's legends. There are bear legends here and there, but they are so scant that it's difficult to pin a whole lot down. I do talk in the book about the legend of the 10-footed bear that some of the native tribes talk about, and this whole legend of this massive bear that purportedly used to live in remote parts of Alaska. And, you know, I'm not necessarily saying it had, you know, really had 10 feet, but at the same time, you know, you can imagine something even much larger, potentially, than the common grizzly bears that we know about. And, you know, maybe some kind of a hybrid or something too that could exist in some of the remote areas.
Well, you know, they have talked about a type of grizzly brown bear mixed with a polar bear for years now. And I think maybe there may be some DNA evidence of that. I don't know. What do you think?
And I discussed that a little bit in the book. I think some of these hybrids, you know, as we learn more, you know, about what's out there in the wild, and we see more interconnectedness of various species, I think we'll see more and more of that proven, and you know, that it'll show some of these unusual sightings that may be as they can be accounted for by some of these hybrid creatures.
Mm. Now, you know, I've been into the winged cryptid thing more recently than before, but I have been for a long time. What type of winged cryptids have you heard about up there?
Well, thunderbirds are the big one.
Yeah.
And, you know, the thunderbird legends, of course, again, go back amongst the native people up there. But there's also been some fairly modern sightings. I mean, there was a famous sighting in the 1970s. There was a gentleman who was flying a Cessna 207, and he saw this what he described as this massive bird. Now, he believed that the wingspan was about 14 feet. He calculated that from his experience with his plane and gauging that by, you know, the wing of one of the Cessnas he was flying. And that's a pretty impressive wingspan. It's not necessarily outside the bounds of, you know, a known creature, but at the same time, you know, it's not something you necessarily want to see swooping down on you when you're out walking your dog or something. So, you know, there's some pretty amazing things. I mean, there was a sighting in January 2018, so just, you know, a couple of years ago, and this was somebody who called in and said that she had seen this giant bird, and, you know, wanted to know if anybody else had seen it. It was in the Mendenhall Valley, area, which is outside of, it's around Juneau. So, we're talking about a populated area, and she observed this thing for, long enough to get a good look at it. And she's a longtime Alaskan resident and said, this is not a known creature. I've seen, all these other things that you're saying it could potentially be. I've seen these creatures. This is not what I saw. This is something, unknown, essentially. So it's fascinating when you hear these stories. Honestly, they have a whole different atmosphere of believability in a way when you're looking at an area like Alaska, because you can begin to understand something like that, why they're not seen as often, perhaps, or, how they're possibly living, because something that's winged that's that large, a Thunderbird or whatever this thing is, probably has a very large hunting range and can easily be out over remote areas of the Alaskan tundra and just not be seen for a long time until somebody spots it.
Yeah, I know. I know Ken did the forward in your book, and I know him and Jax Atwell. I talked to both of them about some of these large bird sightings up there. Ken seems to think that this may very well be something. Something somebody actually seen. Of course, but the area is so remote. I don't know where he was exactly. He was up in Denali, around that area. But it seems that these large bird sightings do pop up every once in a while.
Yeah, they do. And of course, it's like a lot of other places. There are many accounts that just don't get reported.
Right.
People don't want to talk about them. They don't want the publicity. They don't want to, come out and say, "Oh, yes, I saw this thing," because even with the different level of acceptability of these topics, many people are still very reluctant to go into too much detail about what they've experienced.
Yeah, it's kind of like, and very well how the Dene and Navajo legends are. They don't like to talk about it, and for the most, especially the older folks. But I guess it's the same way up there. They, I guess it's ingrained to them, not to talk to the outsiders too much about that.
It is, and sometimes it's a matter of, some of these topics are considered sacred, some of them are considered taboo, some of them are considered frightening, and there's a lot of people that, they won't go into it in too much detail because they're afraid of experiencing it again, for instance, of having their dialogue about it attracting the creature's attention, and they don't want that.
Yeah, I know there have been talk about some type of humanoids, unknown humanoids that would come out of the woods and steal children. I think most of that was in the Kenai Peninsula area. Well, that's a big area. But what do you know about that?
Yeah, that's, there's a lot of disappearances in Alaska.
Yeah, it is.
It's kind of a big topic. I mean, to a certain degree, I understand, and it doesn't surprise me because of the terrain, and because so many people, I think, are just unprepared for the Alaskan wilderness. And, this is an area that, I've been out there, and you can, you can go just a couple of clicks away from the road, and if you don't have a really good sense of direction or you haven't marked your trail, you can easily be lost very quickly. And turned around, especially when there's snow on the ground, everything's white. What do you have? Maybe you have your tracks you can follow, but if you don't have that, you're in a tough predicament. And with so much wilderness, it's hard to find a lot of these people that disappear. The other factor is, and a lot of people don't realize this, there's a lot of crime in Alaska. I was very surprised to learn at one point that when I was spending time in Anchorage, how bad the crime rate is in Anchorage, and how many international gangs operate in the city of Anchorage because it's so easy for all of these people to get in and out. So you've got Russian gangs, Chinese, American, European. It's an incredible mix of forces that are operating in that small community. So that's a factor you have to consider, and all of those things they start to add up to. Wow. Well, yeah, there's a lot of disappearances, but there are also a lot of different explanations. Now, as far as supernatural forces, yeah, there's always been stories of strange disappearances, and sometimes those are associated with various creatures that, whether it's the Krishtika, the hairy man, or whatever, that maybe live in the dense forests of Alaska and come in and abduct people for whatever reason. But those stories are always a bit elusive to chase down details on and to really understand, outside of someone coming back and saying, I was taken by one of these creatures and I got away. We sort of don't know, do we?
No. And I've heard so many stories, especially around the Nome, Alaska area, of actual alien abductions or UFO abductions and people. Well, of course, they made a movie about it, which was, all speculation. But, I don't know if that has to do with it. I know there's a lot of UFO activity or strange lights seen up there, but I really I'm like you. You can get out there in the wilderness at night and you're lost and you're not getting back. It can be very easy to get lost and just lose your sense of direction.
Yeah, and it's funny, people ask me that movie was The Fourth Kind, and
Yeah.
people ask me about that all the time. And there's
oh man,
the movie was made for entertainment, obviously, and it's a very unsettling movie. I mean, it's very atmospheric and it is quite chilling. But yeah, there are a lot of sightings and encounters up there. Again, when you start considering the environment, I mean, it's one thing to encounter a UFO, you're outside of your town or you're driving across a highway somewhere. But I mean, you place that in the context of a very remote area where you consciously know that civilization is still a lot of miles away, for instance, or the gas station you passed 2 hours ago is long closed and there's nothing else. It adds a different element to that encounter. And I've interviewed people who've had sightings up there, and it's very different in nature just because the place is very different.
Yeah, and I've never been up there, but some of the stuff I've heard over the years is pretty chilling. And of course, there's just not a whole lot of explanation for a lot of it. What do you think it may be the next? I don't know, the next cryptid phenomena that rears its ugly head in Alaska in the near future?
Oh wow.
Well, let me put it this way. Now, you've been hearing about all these bizarre pale humanoid sightings that have been grabbing the cryptid news over the past several months. Seems like these things are everywhere. People are seeing something. And of course, there was this film that I don't even know if it was Alaska, but I know it was up in that part of the country or part of the world. Where this thing kind of walked up onto a moose. I don't know if it was digital or CGI or whatever, but people are reporting these things. Have you been hearing anything like that, anything similar to that up there?
No, I know the accounts that you're talking about, and I haven't heard any of those come out of Alaska recently. No. There's always reports of known animals that are beyond normal size. Sasquatch reports certainly continue to flow out of there. Water monster reports do too. I mean, there's so much water in Alaska, and not And that's not a crack just about the snow and the ice, but I mean, if you look at the shape of Alaska and how many of the islands, stretch out into the water, I mean, you've got cultures that, are built around fishing and very water-based culture. So there's constantly things that are cited that are anomalous and unexplained. So you have that whole factor, and then of course all the freshwater lakes and everything too. But I don't know. It's going to be interesting, I think, to see what happens in, say, the next 6 months to a year, simply because, of course, much of the world has been living in very closed off conditions like Alaskans typically live, because there's all of these quarantines and all this crazy stuff. There's a lot of people who live in Alaska and they don't, they're not out and about all the time because the climate, the conditions don't allow it. So when things start to sort of open back up again, it's going to be interesting to see what kind of new reports we get out of there, and what kind of cryptid reports in general. And that's kind of commentary on what you're talking about with these sudden sightings of all these pale entities, which I've noticed that they have just started surfacing with the quarantine conditions being lifted in a lot of places. So I think we're in for some interesting changes.
Well, we're getting them here in Pennsylvania. I mean, and that's something I never thought we'd be getting here. And we're on 2 active investigations currently that are pretty solid reports. So God knows what they are. I mean, hopefully we can get a little bit of insight as to what it is. There is one phenomena in Alaska and other parts of the north, I would say, are these mammoths. People seeing relic mammoths. What's the deal on that?
I love these stories. Partially just because, it's kind of a legend of survival in a sense. So the story is that there are legends of mammoths having survived in remote parts of Alaska. Now, that sounds fantastic when you first start hearing it, and it sounds, for me, it sounds really cool, to imagine that. When you really delve into it, there are sadly not really many modern reports to speak of, but there are reports that from the 1800s and so, and even a couple from the early 1900s. That talk about woolly mammoths living in Alaska. There are legends that some of the native people, had stories of hunting these creatures, and they even produced, bones and tusks and so forth, and even meat at one point. So when you take it all as a whole, when you start delving into it, what it seems to indicate is that there's a strong possibility that these woolly mammoths survived much, much longer than modern science believes that they did. Yeah. Now, I should add that there's really kind of a whole swath of territory that produces these stories. It's remote parts of Alaska and also remote parts of Russia, Siberia have produced some of these stories. And occasionally you'll see purported photographs. There was even a video a couple of years ago that, reportedly showed a mammoth strolling across, part of Siberia or something. A lot of this stuff is just, unfortunately, CGI or Photoshop and things like that. So, it's disappointing when you start looking at those aspects, but when you do dig into the legends and the lore of these creatures, you find that there's a good indication that they survived much longer than is commonly accepted. Now, for me, I think that's very fascinating, still, even though I'd love to think that there's a herd of them roaming around the tundra somewhere, but, I always leave the door open because, hey, anything's possible in this crazy world. But, the indications are, like I said, that they did survive for a time in Alaska. And I would love for somebody to come up with even more solid evidence that brings it even closer to home.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think I think there is a good possibility that woolly mammoths actually existed past the Ice Age. Maybe not for many millennia, but I think it did go longer than what most scientists believe.
Yeah, certainly so. And I think in isolated pockets,
Yeah.
So, of course, now all the talk is that they're going to clone it and bring it back to life. So
yeah,
maybe they'll set them loose in Alaska, and we'll have that anyway.
Yeah, well, I hope people watch Jurassic Park. Yeah, I mean,
I understand the fascination though, because in a way, and I understand why. For me, the reports are intriguing because it's kind of a story of potential survival, isn't it?
Right.
I mean, I think that's one of the reasons that the thylacine captures so many people's attention, and I genuinely believe that they're still living in the wilds in Australia, and I think there's good potential of that being proven in the next 1 to 5 years. But man, what a comeback story! Something like that is presumed extinct and long gone. Be like a modern coelacanth, which was something else that everyone swore was long gone. But wow, here's this prehistoric fish. Guess what? It's still alive.
Mm-hmm.
So certainly the potential for other species like that turning back up in different isolated areas of the planet still exists.
Yeah, I think the tiger may very well end up being. I mean, it's being around certain parts of Alaska, not necessarily in Tasmania, but I think in Alaska themselves, it may very well be there. I mean, it's so vast. I mean, and there have been some evidence that may actually suggest that it is still alive.
Yeah, and it's going to be, kind of a real triumph for cryptozoology because, a lot of us have long professed that it still exists out there in the wilds in Australia. And, I think once that's proven, it's going to be eye-opening for a lot of people. So, but back to Alaska, I mean, the potential is there too for unknown species. I mean, there's so much vast land, and the climate, of course, makes it very difficult for extensive research. So, I know a few researchers up there, but they have to deal with conditions that limit their investigations and explorations to parts of the year and areas that are difficult to access. So when they can get in there and check those things out, they do. And who knows? I mean, somebody might stumble on something mind-boggling in Port Chatham one day.
So, David, what's going on in the future? What do you have planned? I know this COVID thing has everybody's schedule screwed up, but what do you plan on getting or having or being done later on this year?
Yeah, so this craziness with this COVID stuff. I mean, it's canceled so many events for people like me to speak. But if conditions hold, I'll be speaking at the Falk Monster Festival at the beginning of August in Falk, Arkansas. And I'll also be at the Van Meter Festival in September in Van Meter, Iowa. In terms of other projects, I've got a slew of books finished and coming out in the next, probably 2-3 weeks. The next installment in the Haunted series that I've been writing with Ross Allison will be out. That is on haunted churches. Beyond that, there'll be the next book in this Cryptid series, and the focus this time is on Indiana. So put the cover up for that. You can see it on my website on eerielights.com. The book is called Monsters at the Crossroads, and the featured cryptid on the cover is the Beast of Busco. Oscar is a giant turtle, and that's a whole cool story. So
I'm looking forward to that because, like I told you before, Indiana has a Oh, it has a ton of stuff that comes out of there.
It does. It's very rich in some incredible stories. I had a good time with that one, and I spent a lot of time in Indiana. So it was another one like Alaska. It was a matter of distilling down and saying, okay, I've got to really focus this and give a good overview, because you could do several volumes just on the Sasquatch sightings alone in the state.
Right.
But some really great monster stories out of there. And I'm going to keep going with those. People keep asking me if I'm going to do all 50 states. And I just say, well, hold on and keep watch.
Well, David, thanks again for coming on the show. You're always welcome here. And I look forward to reading your stuff in the future.
Hey, no worries, man. I appreciate it. And you have a good night, okay?
You take care.
Thanks, Lon.
Now, if you have an unexplained encounter or sighting, feel free to contact me through the Families of Monsters blog site. If you're interested in supporting Families of Monsters and Arcane Radio, you can use the PayPal donation buttons on the blog and newsletter. I appreciate your continued support. We do have a new YouTube channel, Beyond Explanation. It's a collection of first-person encounters directly from the pages of Families of Monsters. And now you get the opportunity to listen and watch some of the thousands of intriguing eyewitness reports I've received over the years. So once again, I want to thank David for joining me this evening, and I want to thank you for listening to the show. Good night, stay healthy, and have a safe and enjoyable weekend.